In this lesson, I'm going to talk about cookies and session tracking. And as in previous lessons, I would like to divide the lesson into several parts. And in the first part, I'd like to explain the concept of session tracking. First of all, we need to understand what is session. A session is a limited time or duration of communication between the two systems or two parts. For example, some sessions may involve a client and a server, while other sessions involve two personal computers. The term session can also be used in the real world. For example, I have an appointment with someone to chat on Skype from 8 to 9 p.m. So I can say we will have a session of communication between me and that person that lasts from 8 to 9 p.m. So now let's move on to the concept of session tracking. In many situations, a web application needs to remember the past activities of a user. For example, a user of an online store may add an item to a shopping cart and then browse the store a little bit. And after that, add another item to the shopping cart. The web application needs to remember the past activities. So the first item the user added to the shopping cart should still be there. And the web application also needs to remember the user so that it doesn't add the item to somebody else's shopping cart. If you did some network programming before, you may think that this is easy to do because there would be a continuous connection between the client and the server. And for each client, there would be a thread or process on the server that handles just that client. Unfortunately, the HTTP protocol is not designed that way. HTTP is called stateless protocol. And this means that the server handles each request individually. And after a request is handled, the server immediately forgets about the request and the client who sent the request. The connection between the client and the server is usually lasts only a few seconds, just enough time to send back the requested page. The statelessness of HTTP is actually a very important reason why the protocol is so efficient and scalable. But it also makes it impossible to track user by HTTP itself. So what is the trick to handle this? The trick is that instead of maintaining a constant connection between the client and the server will issue a unique identifier to each client. This identifier is usually called a session ID. And whenever the client sends a request to the server, it includes a session ID as part of the request. And by looking at the session ID, the server will know which client the requests come from. So the way it works is illustrated in this example. Note that the first request doesn't have a session ID, so the server will know it's from a new client. The server would then generate a new session ID, which is typically a unique random number, and send it back to the client as part of the response. And all the subsequent requests from the client will include the session ID, and this establishes a virtual session between client and server. Note that a session can be terminated by either the client or the server. For example, the client may decide not to include a session ID in a request, and then the server will treat that request as a start of a new session. The server can also decide invalidate a session ID, or in other words, not to recognize it in future requests. So that's the concept of session tracking. And the main point of session tracking is to use uh, integer that is generated by the server, and this number is called session ID. And the main purpose of session tracking is to uh, help the web application to memorize the past activity of the user and provide personality for the user. So this is the end of this part of the lesson.